Good evening. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're going to be learning Maseches, Moed, Kattan, Daf Kavches, and finishing the Masechta as we wrap around to the top of Chavtes and Aleph, only 12 lines or so of Gemara. That will bring us to the close of the Masechta, Baruch Hashem. And just a very interesting Tosfos, even before we start. I know that's a little strange, but if you look at the top Tosfos on Kavches and Beis, Rashi, Tosfos here has a very strange line. Tosfos Dibra Maschil Bila Hamaves. He says, "Kedei l'sayim b'davar hatov mishum de moed katan hu sof seder moed." Wow, what does that mean? We have chagiga. So there's a discussion in the Rishonim as to where we end seder moed. But that discussion that Tosfos highlights here is a larger discussion, a bigger conversation in the Rishonim and in the Achronim as well. And nevertheless, it's not the way that our Shas is structured. Our Daf Yomi is different. Our Siddharim are organized slightly differently. Ikra and Shal Dvarim is that we have a lot of Torah to learn, and whether or not it's officially part of this Seder or another, we're going to learn Maseches Chagiga to follow. So let's get started with 4 lines from the bottom of Chav Zayin and Beis, and a lot of ground to cover. We'll read quickly. There's just a lot of words, and in Yirtzeh Hashem, over the course of the next little while, we'll have the opportunity to finish the Masechta. Amar Reb Levi. Avel shlosha yamim rishonim yira'eh es atzmo ki'ilu cherev munachas lo bein shtei kseifa. And Avel, for the first 3 days, he should be fearful as though there is a sword resting between his shoulders. Mishlosha ad shiva, from days 3 to 7, he should be fearful, but less so. Ki'ilu munachas lo kenegido, but karen zavis, that the sword isn't on his back or on his neck, but it's opposite him from coming out of the corner of the wall. Mikan ve'elach, after that amount of time, ki'ilu overes kenegdo bashuk, still less fear. This is speaking about the spillover from a gzeira ra, and we should have a decreasing fear as time moves along from other things happening. We had said in our Mishnah, lo shel nashim le'olam mipnei hakavod, that a woman, when she passes away, she's never allowed to be, her body's never allowed to be left out in a public format after she's passed away. But Amrei Nahardoi, they said in the city of Nahardoi that this wasn't always true. It depends on the scenario. Lo shanu elochaya, turning to the top of Kavches Medal. It's only true for a woman who died in childbirth. And the Rishonim here explain, Rashi here at the top, or whoever this Rashi is, what we were concerned about is that she still may be exuding blood from her body, and because that's the case, she would therefore, it would be a busha for her, and that's not allowed. Aval, the Gemara continues, Sha'ar nashim manichin. However, other women who did not die because of childbirth, they would be allowed to have their beds out. Then Rebbe Lazar Amar, he disagrees entirely and says, Afilu she'ar hanashim, and all women are going to be in this category. Excuse me, just 1 second, please. So the Gemara says on the top line, Rabbi Eliezer Amar, Afilu she'ar hanashim, no women should be left out. It's not appropriate. How do we know this? That she died there and she was buried there. And the Gemara makes a diuk samuch lemisa kavura, that we should not have a woman's body stay out for any length of time, even though for a man, and maybe according to some, for some women, yes, but that's not the sheet of Rabbi Elazar, that they should be buried right away. Af Miriam beneshika mesa, that Miriam died with the kiss of death, and we know this from Gzeira Shava of Asya Sham Sham, and the Gzeira Shava comes from the pasuk Vatamas Sham Miriam and Vayamas Sham Moshe, and then the Gemara says why by Miriam does it not say Al Pi Hashem? It says it by Moshe. Why does it not say Al Pi Hashem? So the Gemara responds because it's inappropriate to reference that a Kadosh Baruch Hu would be menashik al peh in regards to a woman. It's not modest. It's hard to understand that, but that's what the Gemara says. Maybe just the anthropomorphism of the physicality of God. There is no such thing, but the Gemara was sensitive to it and says that it's therefore the Torah was sensitive to it. That's why it doesn't say Al Pi Hashem by Miriam. Amar Avami, Lama nismecha misas Miriam la parshas para aduma. Why was the death of Miriam juxtaposed in the Chumash next to the Parsha Para Aduma? So to that, the Gemara responds, that just like the Para Aduma can generate atonement, so too can the death of tzaddikim can generate atonement for others. It's a bit of a chiddush idea that one person's death can create kapara for another, but that's what the Gemara says about tzaddikim. Amar Rebbe Lazar, last short line, Lama nismecha misas Aaron the big day kahuna. Why was the parsha of Aaron, the death of Aaron, juxtaposed in the Chumash to the parsha of big day kahuna? Ma big day kahuna mechaprin. Just like when the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim would wear the big day kahuna and it would be able to generate kapara for Klal Yisrael. So too af misas and shel tzadikim mechaperes. So too when it comes to the death of tzadikim, then atonement can be generated. The Bryce is now going to go through speeds at which one Rahman al-Itzlan passes away, going in shortest order to the longest order. Tana Rabban and Meis Pisam, if a person dies right away, zo he misa chatufa, their life was grabbed from them extremely fast. Chala yom echad umeis, if a person was sick for only one day and died, zo he misa dchufa, this is a slightly lesser form of immediacy with which they died. Rabbi Hananel ben Gamliel Omer, he says, no, when a person dies within one day, zohi misa magefa, that's actually called a plague. Shene'emar, ben adam hineni lokech mimches machmad einecha b'magefa. I'm going to take that which is the beauty of your eye in a plague. Uchsiv, in another pasuk says, v'adaber la'am baboker, v'tamas ishti ba'erev, and this person would die, this man's wife died within one day of her illness, and therefore we see that a magefa, which is followed by this one day, therefore a one day death is considered a magefa. If a person is ill and dies within 2 days, zohi misa dchuya, still a lesser form of a fast death, but still very fast. Shlosha gara, 3 is as if you're being screamed at. Arba nazifa, and dying over 4 days is as if someone's turned their back on you. Chamisha zohi misas kol adam, and a person who dies after 5 days of illness, that's still considered to be a misas kol adam. That's not considered to be any of these fast versions of death, even though it still sounds terribly short. Amar Rav Chanan Mikra, how do we know that this pasuk, that the pasuk of Kol Adam is 5, that it's 5 days? It says the Gemara, Hein Karvu Yamecha Lamus, and the Gemara tears apart the pasuk. Hein is Chad, that's 1. Karvu is plural, Trey. Yamecha is multiple days, Trey. That's Chamisha. So 1 plus 2 plus 2 is 5 days. How do we know that Hein is Chad? The Gemara says, Shekem B'lashon Yavani Koran La'achas Hein, that we know in Yavani that the language of 1 is used by the word Hein, and the pasuk says Hein Karvu. If a person dies, meis b'chamishim shana, if a person dies around their 50th birthday, says the Gemara, he misas kares, that's the death of a person who dies from an onesh kares. Chamishim u'shtayim shana, a person who dies at the age of 52. So the Gemara says, zohi misas shel Shmuel haramati, that's when Shmuel hanavi died. Shishim, zohi misa b'dei shamayim, if a person dies at 60, that is a death that is b'dei shamayim. And the Gemara says, Amar Marzotra Mikra, how do we know that this is true? Tavo bakelach eli kaver. So it says you will come bekelach, which we don't know what that means yet, to me in a grave. Bekelach begamatria shisin havu. It's 60. So that's how we know that it's misa b'dei shamayim. That's what the pasuk was talking about, misa b'dei shamayim. And then this person died at that age, and that's the gematria of bekelach, which is 60. Shivim seva. If a person lives until 70, then that's considered a ripe old age. That's a good age to die at, as it were. No age is a good age to die at, but that's what the Gemara says is seva, that's already considered old age. Shmonim is gevuros. To live until 80 is the age of gevura, which is a well-known pasuk that we read regularly. So that's what the pasuk says, that for a gevura, that's 80 years. Amar Rabba, michamishim ve'ad shishim shana. Rabba looks back at this Bryce and says something's missing. From age 50 to age 60, zohi misas kares. It's not just 50 like the Bryce says. Why doesn't it say what the actual Netziah says? At 50 to 60, anyone who dies in that age bracket, that's misas kares. Says the Gemara, the reason why it wasn't included in this list was mishum kvodo shel Shmuel haramati. That's because Shmuel died at 52. And it appears then, if you are correct, that people who die from 50 to 59, that those people who are chiyuvei kares, that implies then that Shmuel was chayv kares. And that's not respectful. Rabbi Yosef Kihava Bar Shisin, when he hit his 60th birthday, Avad Lahu Yom Tov Rabbanon. He made a yom tov for the rabbis. He brought a sushi platter to shul, and he brought some schnapps. Amar Nafki Limi Kares. I've exited the decade when people die from kares. I'm 60 now. So when a person is 60, it means that they didn't die from a chiyuv kares. Amar le'abayni hida nafak le'mar mi kares tishani. You're correct that you escaped the death of kares as it relates to the years of kares, which is ages 50 to 59. Mi kares tiyomi mi nafik mar. A person can still be chayv kares both before and after that time. These aren't perfect rules. These rules they're different applications of kares. It's true that from 50 to 59, a person can die and it'll be a chiyuv kares, but lav dafka. They could be 100 and they could die from a chiyuv kares too if they do something wrong in that yom, in that day. Amar le Abai, Amar le At least let me take half. At least let me be proud of the fact that I didn't die from. Okay, you're right. It may still be that a person can die from kares that happens on any one day, but at least it wasn't. I made it through the 10 years. That's all he's saying. At least I got half of what I wanted. So the Gemara is going to tell a few stories about people who died. The Gemara says, Rav Huna nach nafshe pisam. He died right away. And as we learned at the top of the Gemara, so that is considered to be a misa chatufa. That's considered to be a very rushed death. So the Gemara says, Havu kadaige rabbanan. The rabbis were very concerned why Rav Huna is dying a death pisam. That he's not the right person to be dying a death pisam. We've already learned Gemaras about Rav Huna, that he was buried next to Rav Chia, the whole story with the fire and the kever with Rav Chaga. So says the Gemara, Tana lehu zuga de me Hadaiv, that from the city of Hadaiv, lo shanu ela shelo higia legvuros. When do we say that there's a problem of a misa chatufa when a person dies misas pisom? That's only true when you're less than 80. But if you're already above the age of 80 and then a person passes away very quickly, that's not a bad thing. It's not considered. It's actually even better. Aval higia legvuros. If a person reaches the age of 80 and then they pass away quickly, zohi misas neshika. That's considered to be death by a kiss of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's considered a lofty level. That's how Miriam died, and that's how Moshe died, as we started today's daf. Omar Rava. Rava says we're halfway down on Kaf Ches Amud Aleph. Chaye, one's length of life. Bane, a person's children. Umizone, and food. Lo b'zchus talya nosa. That's not the kind of thing that's dependent on your zechuyos. Rather, el b'mazlo talya nosa. This is something that's dependent on one's mazel, on one's, what does mazel mean? Astrological. Okay, so these are hard questions for me to answer, but that's what the Gemara says, is that it's dependent on one's mazel. How do we know this to be true? Because the Gemara says there were two great tzaddikim who had very similar morals and tzidkus, but they still had very different lives. Says the Gemara, the Haraba v'Rav Chizda, Tarvayu Rabbanan Tzadike Havu. Both of them were tremendous righteous Jews. Mar Maslei v'Asi Mitra, one of them could daven and rain would fall, and Mar Maslei v'Asi Mitra, the other could daven and bring the rain. They both were very, very powerful tzaddikim. Rav Chizda Chaya Tishin v'Tartin Shnin, and even though they were both equals, Rav Chizda lived until 92. Rabba Chaya Arba'in. Rabba died at the age of 40, lived less than half of the life of his counterpart. Bei Rav Chizda Shisin Hilule. In the house of Rav Chizda, they had 60 wonderful celebrations and weddings with Chule, good family simchas, one after the other. Bei Rabba Shisin Tichle. But in the house of Rabba, they buried 60 people. Terrible. Bei Rav Chizda Smida Lakalbe below Mispai. Smida was a very fine flour. They had food that was made from the finest of flowers that they were serving their dogs. They were very, very wealthy, wildly wealthy people. Rabba was nama desare, a terrible form of bread. We've learned about this in other Maseches as well, that barley flour is considered an inferior type of flour as it relates to bread. And that was le'inche, it was for men, and they didn't even have enough. Very different worlds. He said there were three things that Rava asked for from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Tarte yuavuli, two of them I got, and chada lo yuavuli. There are two things that I got and one that I did not. Chachma say the Rav Huna, I daven for the wisdom of Rav Huna, and I daven ve'osrei de Rav Chizda, and I daven for the wealth level of Rav Chizda, ve'yavuli, and they gave that to me. And v'sanu say the Rabbi Bar Rav Huna, lo yavuli. But when I davened to also have the humility of Rabbi Bar Rav Huna, that they did not grant me. Some of the Rishonim are very bothered by this. This is one of those things that you don't daven for. Anivus is, these are not things that you daven for. That's what the Gemara said recently that we learned, that Hakol b'dei shamayim chutz miyira shamayim. This is something that you have to work on. The anivus is a mita that a person has to work on. So that's a kasha in the Gemara, not in the Gemara, but on the Gemara that some of the Meforshim ask. Rav Seorim, this is not barley, this is a person's name. And in fact, the Hagos V'Tzionim changes it to a samech. Rav Seorim was Achva de Rava. He was the brother of Rava, Hava Yosef Kame de Rava, and he was sitting in front of Rava during Rava's last moments of life. Chazie Dahava Kamenamne, and he saw that his brother was about to pass away. Omar Le, Rava, who was dying, said to his brother Rav Seorim, Lema le mar de lo li tza'aron, please say something to the Malach HaMaves to make the death for me, said Rava, so that it's not painful. Amar le mar lav shushvinehu. He says to Rava, you're Rava, you don't have a connection to the Malach HaMaves. Of course you do. Amar le, well, kevan de imsar mazle, lo ashkachbi, because I am imsar mazle. What does imsar mean? So if you take a look at Rashi, or its a replacement, so Rashi says 6 lines down, imsar mazle, isra mazle. I don't know what the etymology is of the word imsar, but Rashi translates it as isra, that he has a very bad mazel. So says the Gemara, therefore, because his mazel was bad, lo ashkach bi. Normally, you're right, said Rava, I do have a connection with the Malach HaMaves, but here I don't, he won't listen to me. Okay? Amar li. So the brother of Rav Seorim said to Rava, after you die, can you please appear to me in a dream and tell me what the experience was like? So finally, Rava passed away. And Rava showed up in a dream to Rav Seorim, to his brother. Amar le, havale lamar tzara, was the death process very painful for you? So he responded, Amar le, ki rivda de kuslisa, no different than the incision of a bloodletter. I can tell you from experience, the sharper the scalpel, the less pain you feel. So if you have a good bloodletter, it's not so painful, but you still feel something. It's not a nothing. It still hurts. Rava have a Yosef Kamed Rav Nachman. Now we go back in time because this previous story said that Rava died. So we're obviously going back one generation. Rava have a Yosef Kamed Rav Nachman. Rava, who was a 4th century Amora, was sitting with his Rebbe, Rav Nachman. And Rava saw that Rav Nachman was on the way to passing out and to passing away. Amar le lema le mar de lo litzara. Rav Nachman says to Rava, can you please daven for me? Daven to the Malach HaMaves, ask the Malach HaMaves to protect me so that it's not so painful. Amar li mar, he says to him, my master, Lav Adam Chashuvu, you're an Adam Chashuv, Rav Nachman, you don't need my help. Amar le, man Chashiv, man Safin, man Rakia, who are these greats? Who are these ones who know how to control the heavens? We're nothings. We're nothings. We don't have any control over anything. So ending that part of the conversation, but continuing as we did with the previous story with Rava and his brother, Amar le lischazi limar. Rava says to Rav Nachman, please come tell me in a dream how the death was. So finally, Rav Nachman passed away. And and then he showed him in a dream, he showed up to him in a dream, and Amar le, havale lamar tzara. Was it uncomfortable for you? Amar le, kimishchal binta mechalba. It was like taking a piece of hair out of milk, which seems to be not painful at all. So interesting to note that from within one generation, where when Rav Nachman died, the comparison was to a piece of hair out of milk. But when Rava died, it was like an incision of a scalpel. One generation's difference. I don't know how the Yerida Sadoros would play out for our generation. And then the Gemara says about Rav Nachman, V'yamar HaKadosh Baruch Hu zil be'ahu alma kad havias. I'll send you back into the world exactly like you are. Lo ba'ina denafish bi'asusa. I wouldn't accept it because I would have been way too afraid. Just the fear of the Malach HaMaves was worse than the death itself. Stories in the Gemara about how the Malach HaMaves tried to take the lives of some of the great Amoraim. So the Gemara says as follows. We're about 12 lines or so, maybe a little bit more from the bottom of the page, on Kav Ches Amud Aleph, and the Gemara says, here we are. Rabbi Lazar have a ka'achil truma. Rabbi Lazar was eating truma. Ischazile, and the Malach HaMaves showed up. Amar le, Rabbi Lazar says to the Malach HaMaves, Truva ka'achilna, v'lav kodesh ikri. Well, you can't even mess around with halacha. The halacha is that this is kodesh, and if you make me a mace, then I'm going to be making this truma into something that's tummy. So some of the Rishonim say that the Malach HaMaves was so embarrassed because he should have known the halacha and he didn't pick up on it. So chalfalei shaitam, the time for this person to die had passed, and the Malach HaMaves did not take his life at this time. Rav Sheshes Yischazi lebeshuka. Rav Sheshes was out in the marketplace, and the Malach HaMaves showed up to him at that point. Amar le beshuka kibehema. You're going to let me die in the shuk like an animal? That's not right. Asiya isa legabe besa. At least wait till I get home. Then you can take my life over there. Rav Ashi Yischazi lebeshuka. Rav Ashi was out in the marketplace, and that's when the Malach HaMaves showed up for him. Amar le israch litzlasin yomin. Please give me 30 days. Wait 30 days. Please allow me to go over all of my Torah. Amrisu, because as we know the well-known saying, it's a wonderful attribute, a wonderful merit for a person to show up in Olam Haba and Talmudo biyado, that they should be able to know the Torah that they've learned. So amazingly, Ki'ilu, like he put a reminder in his phone, the Malach HaMaves showed up exactly on day 30. B'yom Tlasin Asa, exactly on day 30, the Malach HaMaves shows up. So says the Gemara, Amar le, he says to him, Rav Ashi says to the Malach HaMaves, my kulei, what is this, such an exacting measure? You're showing up on day 30. Why is this happening? So the Malach HaMaves says, I'm coming to you with a real reason. The reason I'm pushing for your death is kadach karagle de barnasan. because you are pushing the legs of Bar Nasan. Bar Nasan is a reference to Rav Huna Bar Nasan, and Rav Huna Bar Nasan became the Rosh Yeshiva after Rav Ashi. And we know, says the Malach HaMaves, Ve'ein malchus nogas bechaverta afilu kimelonima. It's not appropriate to take the malchus of another person for even one hair's breadth, and therefore it's time for you to die. Rav Chizda was such a tzaddik, he never stopped learning. Lo hava yachile. Malach HaMaves could never find the time to kill him. He never stopped learning. To lo hava shasig pume migirsa. He never stopped learning. When he was sitting down, he was learning. When he was stood up, he was, and then never stopped learning. Just that you can't be killed if you're learning. So it says the Gemara, Salik Yasi be'arza de Beirab. So he went up onto the erez, onto the cedar of Beirab, Paka Arza, and it cracked, made a sound with shasak, and he stopped learning. And that's how he died. So too by Reb Chia, he was not able to be approached by the Malach HaMaves. So one day the Malach HaMaves put on a costume and he showed up like a poor person. Also, he came over and he knocked on the door. Amar Le, and he says to Reb Chia, Apikli Rifta, can you please give me a piece of bread? I'm very hungry. Afikule. So of course, that's what Jews do. He gave him a loaf of bread. Amar Le, just like you're being so merciful on me as though I'm a poor person. Ahahu Gavra Amai Lo Kamarachemar. Why are you not being thoughtful and sensitive to the Malach HaMaves? You should be sensitive to him too. Galilei, he revealed himself. The Malach HaMaves then revealed himself to Reb Chia as the Malach HaMaves, and Achvile Shuta Denura, and he showed him this rod of fire, and Amsile Nafshe, and then he offered up his own soul. He just offered up his own soul, Reb Chia, to the Malach HaMaves. Very, very difficult Gemara on a whole bunch of levels. How is that allowed? Or suicide in halacha? All of these different sugyas that are complicated. But in some of the Meforshim, this was considered praiseworthy. The level of tzidkus that Reb Chia had, he was mamish naki b'lichet. That it wasn't. Can't say I fully understand it, but it wasn't considered a crime in halacha. That brings us to the final Mishnah in the Masechta, and as mentioned in the first Tosfos on this page that we started with today, possibly in the end of the Seder, but we still do learn Chagig over here. Nashim b'moed ma'anos. When women are mourning the loss of loved ones during a Moed, ma'anos, they are allowed to wail in unison. Aval lo metapchos, but they cannot clap their hands. Rabbi Shmuel Omer hasmuchos lamita metapchos, that if a person was close to the mace where the person died, then they can even clap their hands. B'roshei chodashim b'chanukah u'v'purim, when it comes to these holidays, ma'anos u'metapchos, they can both sing in unison and clap hands. Bazeh u'vazeh, but in all of these cases, in the Moed, and Chol HaMoed, and on Rosh Chodesh and Chanukah and Purim, you're not allowed to be Mekonanos. Mekonanos, as we'll see in a minute, was a responsive type of wailing that they would do. One person would wail one thing, and all the other women would respond in kind. Eizahu Inui, what's considered Me'anos, this language that we started with of calling things out together. Shekulan onos ka'achas. Everyone is calling out at the same time, a wailing that's done in unison. Kina. So here the Gemara says, what's kina? That one person speaks and then everybody else answers afterwards. Again, as mentioned, responsively. These 3 words, V'isha, Re'usa, one woman, and then her friends say kina. So
I think you skipped a line.
Be considered alternative. They're going to be alternating. Sorry, did someone say something?
What's Nikbar Hames?
What is Nikbar Hames?
Nikbar Hames Veloma Anos. Sorry.
Did I skip a line? Oh, sorry. Thank you. So on the 4th line, it says that they cannot do the alternating. The Mekonanos, they can't do the responsive wailing. Nikbar Hames, if the mace was buried, once the mace was buried, lo me'anos v'lo metapchos, then you cannot do either of them. All of this was only true by the mita when the person was still alive. Thank you for clarifying that. We'll skip back down to where we were. We're on the 7th line of the Gemara, give or take. Aval asid lavo, and this is a famous line that's quoted at nearly every funeral that we have all been to. Aval asid lavo, in the future, hu omer bila hamaves lanetzach u'mach Hashem elokim dima mi'al kol panim. Soon death will stop permanently, and Hashem will wipe the tears off of all of the faces. Says the Gemara, my Amran, opening the Gemara, last short line of the page, Kal Chesem Ad Beis. My Amran, what were some of the things that were said at a mita? Amarav, Vaila Azla, Vaila Chavila. Woe is to the one who has to go, and woe is to the one who has to give a deposit effectively that they have to give back their neshama. Amar Rava, and we'll see a bunch of quotes from him about the Neshei de Shech Netziv, the women who lived in the city of Shech Netziv. Amran Hacha, they would say like this, Vaila Azla, Vaila Chavila, same line. Woe is to those who go, and woe is to the one who has to give back their neshama. The Amar Rava, Neshei de Shech Netziv Amran, Gud Garma Mikacha, one has to break a bone from the tooth, the Namti Mayala Antichi, and the water goes back to its kettle. All of these are going to be mashalim, and each one has a variety of different explanations of what the right explanation is of the mashal, a whole host of them, but we'll stay on the very surface level for all of them. So the water is going to go back to the kettle. That means that the neshama is going to go back to Shamayim. The mountains are all covered. Devar Rami, Debar Rami Uvar Rav Revehu, because he is the one of greats, one of the lofty ones and the one of the great rabbis. Excuse me. It's better for one to be adorned in robes of silk, than to be a person who's completely run out of money. And what that meant is that there would be people who would end up being so poor that others would have to pay for their funerals. Rava adds as well, if a person's running, and the Meforshim explain they're running, they're chasing money their whole life, and then they get to a bridge, they still won't have any money for the bridge. Even if you're the richest person in the world, you don't walk around with bridges. You still need to hire other people. There's a dependency on you and others. So a whole discussion about money that's being spoken about here. My brother, the merchant, please be careful. They're going to check all of your baskets, a reference to going up to Shamayim and being checked in all of your work. We know famously from the Gemara Maseches Shabbos that the first question that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will ask is Nasasav and Asata Be'emuna, were you yashar in your business? And that is hinted to over here, where the baskets are going to be checked. Rava says the last of these lines, Neshei Deshech Netziv Amran Mosa Kimosa. Death is death, umarin chibula, but one can gain something from marin, from yisurim, from very challenging situations. Says the Gemara, Tanya Haya Reb Meir Omer Tov laleches al beis Avel v'chule. It's better to go to the house of a beis Avel. The pasuk ends with v'hacha yitena libo, and the live ones will give things to their heart. What does this mean? My v'hacha yitena libo, says the Gemara, Dvarim shal misa. A person can give to their heart things that have to do with death. The yasped yaspedune, that if a person is going to give a hesped to one, they will benefit by having one. When they die, they'll get a hesped as well. The kaver yikberune, that if one is going to have, if they're going to be buried, then others will bury them. Says the Gemara, the yiton yitanune, if a mace is carried by one, then he will be carried by others. The next line is diadel yidlune, that if you raise your voice in a hesped, then others will raise their voice for you. Bika de amre, here they don't say it's a correlating, it's an inverse. And what's the inverse? Bika de amre de lo yadel yidlune, people who are not overly dramatic in their wailing, but are appropriately dramatic, then they will have others Yidlune who will cry after them. A pasuk that references saying it in the right way and not saying it in the wrong way. The Gemara presents a long story about the death of the son of Rabbi Shmuel. Last of the middle width lines on Kav Ches Amud Beis. Taner Rabbanan Kshemesu Banav Shel Rabbi Shmuel. When the sons of Rabbi Shmuel died, Nichlisu Arba Zakenim Menachamo. There were 4 Chachamim who came to be Menachem Avo. Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Yossi, Aglili, Rabbi Elazar, Ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva. And before they all walked in, Amar Lehem Rabbi Tarfon, Du'usha Chacham Gadahu Baki Ba'agados. So you should know, if you don't already know, Rabbi Shmuel is a big baki in everything, and especially Ba'agados. Al Yikanis Echad Mikem L'soch Divrei Chavero. We need to make sure that we don't overlap on each other when we're talking to him. Everybody say their own shtickle of Divrei Nichumim. Amar Rabbi Akiva, Vani Acharon, I'll be the last one. Rabbi Akiva offers to be the last. It's the hardest job. You're not allowed to say the same thing as everybody else. He offered to be last. When they got there, Pasach Rabbi Shmuel, they sat down, and we're going to learn at the bottom of this page that we're not supposed to speak in a base Avel until the Avel says something. And Rabbi Shmuel, of course, knew that. So he started talking first. His sins are so great, referring to himself. Tachpuhu avelav, he had multiple avelos, one after the other. And not only that, he triach rabosa pam rishona v'shniya. And this is the second child that he lost, and he forced his chaverim to come out a second time. Nene Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon was the first to be Menachem Rabbi Shmuel. The pasuk says, that all of the Jews were boche for the burning. What is this talking about? So Rabbi Tarfon says, Uman Nadav ve'Avihu shelo asu ela mitzvah achas. But Nadav and Avihu, on that particular day, they'd only done one mitzvah. Dechsiv, as the pasuk writes, "Vayakribu bnei Aaron es adam elav." And kach, they got this type of response where the pasuk says that Beis Yisrael yivku es asrefa. Then banav shel Rabbi Shmuel achas kama v'kama. Your kids did a lot more mitzvahs in any one day than Nadav and Avihu, and they got a proper burial with hespedim. So of course your kids will be treated this way as well. Then in Rabbi Yossi Aglili, 2/3 of the way down, V'amar v'saftu lo kol Yisrael v'kavru oso, that there was a hesped for all of the Jews and they buried him. What is this talking about? Halo dvarim kal v'chomer. You can make a kal v'chomer from this pasuk. Uma Avia ben Yeravam, the child of Yeravam, Avia ben Yeravam, shelo asa davar echad tov. In his life, he only did one good thing. Tichsiv be ya'an nimtza bo davar tov. He did only one thing, and still kach, he was still treated with a proper burial and with hespedim from all Yisrael. Then banav shel Rabbi Shmuel alachas kama v'kama. All the more so, Rabbi Shmuel, your children, they're deserving of having a proper hesped and a proper bechi from Klal Yisrael. What was the one thing that Avia ben Yeravam did? My davar tov. So Reb Zera v'Reb Chanina bar Papa. That's a machlokas in the Amoraim. Chad Amar shebital mishmar tova ala regel. He left his post, even though he wasn't so frum, but he left his post and he did aliyah regel. The Chad Amar shebital pardeso shehoshiv Yeravam aviv al hadrachim shelo yalu Yisrael regel. And the other possibility to what he did is not just that he went up and he was ola regel, but what he did is he took away people from their posts who were otherwise trying to prevent Jews from going up to do Aliyah Regel. And because he interrupted them, he was rewarded heavily. And now the third person spoke in front of Rabbi Shmuel. We've had Rabbi Tarfon, and we've had the next one, who was Rabbi Yossi. And now we have Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah. Nene Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah v'Amar b'shalom tamusu b'masrefos abosecha amlachim arishonim asher lefanecha ken yisrefu lach. So the Gemara says, what is this pasuk talking about? V'lo dvarim kal v'chomer. Uma Tzidkiyahu melech Yehuda, and just like Tzidkiyahu melech Yehuda, which this is what the pasuk is talking about, Shelo el asa el mitzvah achas shelo yirmiyah min atid kach, that he was treated so warmly, even though in the Navi itself, there isn't a lot of flowery language about Yirmiyahu being a big tzaddik. We know he is from Chazal, but in the Psukim, it's from the Psukim, it's not apparent that he was a big tzaddik. The one thing that he did is that when he started giving his nevuah, people threw Yirmiyahu in a pit, like some quicksand. And when he heard about it, he saved him. Tzidkiyahu saved him. So because he did that one thing and he was rewarded, banav shel Rabbi Shmuel achas kama v'kama, all the more so. And therefore, that's how he gave his tirei nichumim. Says the Gemara, Nene Rabbi Akiva v'Amar, Bayom ahu yigdal misped b'Yerushalayim ki misped hahad rimon. We saw this Gemara before Maseches Megillah. The Gemara says that on that day, there was great eulogies in Yerushalayim, like there was by Hadad Rimon, the Bikas Migidon. The Amar of Yosef says, what? We don't, that's not a thing. Who was Hadad Rimon and when was there this big eulogy? So it says Rav Yosef, without having the Targum on this particular pasuk, Lo hava yadana my kamar, I would have never known what was going on with this pasuk. Here's how the pasuk translates. The pasuk starts with Bayom Hahu, and it translates Be'idna Hahu. At that time, Yaske Mispede Yerushalayim. There will be large hespedim in Yerushalayim, Ki Mispeda, just like the eulogies of the Achav bar Imri, the Katal Yaseh Hadad Rimon bar Tav Rimon. The person of Achav ben Amri was killed by Hadad Rimon. It wasn't that, like the pasuk seemed to imply on the pshat level, that the hespedim were about Hadad Rimon. They were not. They were on the person that he killed, which was Achav ben Imri. And as well, Yoshia bar Amon, as well as Yoshia bar Amon, the Katal Yaseh Paro Chagir Bikas Megiddo, and as well for another person who was killed by a different person in Bikas Megiddo. And the Gemara says on this pasuk as well, and closing out this story, Achav, who was not a good king, he only did one good thing. That he only did one thing in front of Aram that was good. In any ways, he was still treated this way. End of the story. The Gemara now asks a couple of questions based on psukim that seem to have a stira as to whether or not a person died b'shalom. Amar le Rava, the Rabba bar Meri, Ksiv be b'tzidkiyahu b'shalom tamuz. It says by Tzidkiyahu that he died peacefully. Uchsiv v'es ene Tzidkiyahu iver, that he became blind. So Amar le hachi Amar Rabbi Yochanan, shemeis Nebuchadnezzar b'yamav. Nebuchadnezzar died in his days. That was, he outlived Nebuchadnezzar. If you can imagine outliving the biggest Russia in the world, outliving Hitler in a generation where you were a part of that, and then you heard that Hitler died. I could imagine people who were experienced the horrors of the Holocaust saying, I've seen what I need to see. I can go now. And when you have the Russia died, that's what happened. It was Nebuchadnezzar. You're right. The rest of his life was peaceful because he didn't care what happened to him at that point. Yeah, he went blind, big deal. Doesn't care. He outlived Nebuchadnezzar. You're going to be gathered up with your forefathers, which is always a reference to death, and you'll be gathered up to be buried with them in peace. We'll see, but the pasuk says that he died an awful death. That the archers shot arrows into him. He had so many holes in him. He looked like a colander. He was filled with holes with arrows. That's not a peaceful death. It's okay, but he was willing to die that way and still be considered b'shalom because the Beis Hamikdash was not destroyed while he was alive. A very halachic Gemara and an important one. Amar Rav Yochanan, ein menachemin. When people come to be menachem, they're not allowed. Ein menachemin rishayin lomar davar ad sheyiftach avel. The first person who speaks is the avel. You might want to go in there and talk. It's not about you. It's about him. It's about her. And you're not allowed to speak until the person says something on their own. Shneamar, we know this from the pasuk by Eov. Acharei kain pasach Eov espihu. He opened up his mouth, and then v'hadar rayan alifas hateimani. And only afterwards did he actually get a response from his friend from Elifaz hateimani. Amar Rabbi Abo minayin le'evel shemesa barosh. How do we know that an avel has to sit at the head? Shneamar evchar darkam ve'ashiv rosh ve'eshkon kemelech bigdud. He's like the king that's sitting at the head of its troops. Kasher avelim yinachem, when others are mourning him. Yinachem acharini mashma. The word yinachem seems like it's talking about other people. Doesn't seem like it's talking about him. So says the Gemara, Amar Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, Yinachem ksiv. You're right, it does say that, but it doesn't mean what you're saying that it means. It means that where's this Rashi? Yinachem, Rashi says, Acherim mashma, shemenachem in yoshvin birosh, that the people who are being menachem should sit at the front. So the Gemara says, no, it's Yinachem, it's referring to the Avel himself, the one who is getting comfort, not the one who is giving comfort. So that's what the Gemara says. 4 lines from the bottom. Mar Zutra Amar Mehacha. He says we learn this idea that the Avel should be at the head in the following pasuk. The Sar Mirzach Seruchim. What does this mean? Mirzach Nase Sar Lis Seruchim. This is a reference where the Avel becomes like a prince to those who are around him. So he sits at the head. And Amar Rav Chama Bar Chanina, similarly, Minayin Lechasan Shemesa Barosh. How do we know that a chasan should sit at the head of the table? Says the Gemara, Shneimar kechasan yechahen pe'er, that the chasan and a kohen are compared in this pasuk. Ma kohen barosh, just like a kohen is always the one who's in the rosh. He's always the one who gets the first honors. Av chasan barosh, so too by a chasan. The kohen gufei min olam. How do we know that a kohen gets separate treatment from others? Says the Gemara, we know the Tana debei Rabbi Shmuel v'kidashto. The pasuk says v'kidashto by a kohen l'chol davar shebekdusha. For every opportunity for kedusha, we always give that to a kohen. Livtoach rishon, he should get the first aliyah. Ulevarach rishon, he should get to make the first bracha. He should get to bench. V'lital maniyaf rishon, he should get to take the first portion. All of that is given to a kohen. Amar Reb Chanina. Kasha Yetzias Neshama min aguf. Says the Gemara that the Yetzias Neshama from a guf is difficult for the body. As we turn to the last blot and the last amud and the last few lines of the Masechta, Kitzipuri b'fi aveshet, like pulling a knotted thread through a small hole. Rav Yochanan Amar, it's not like that thread, like turning like a knotted thread, but rather kifturi, like cables, like very thick ropes, b'fi aveshet, through a small hole. Amar Rab Levi. Bar Chisa, Haniftar min hameis, when a person is leaving the presence of a mace, lo yomar lo lech le shalom, ela lech bishalom. One should not tell someone that they should go le shalom with a lamed, but bishalom with a base. Haniftar min achai, but when one is leaving someone who's alive, lo yomar lo lech bishalom, ela lech le shalom. So when a person's dying, we say bishalom, and when a person is alive, we say le shalom. Haniftar min hameis, lo yomar lo lech le shalom, ela lech bishalom. Where do we know that from? Shnei Amar. The pasuk says, "Ve'ata tavo el avosecha b'shalom," a well-known pasuk from Sefer Bereshis. Haniftar min achai lo yomer lech b'shalom ela lech l'shalom. How do we know that when you're leaving someone who's alive, you say l'shalom instead of b'shalom? Sheharei, we saw a bad example of this. Sheharei David shamar le'avshalom lech b'shalom halach v'nidla. That didn't end well. He ended up getting killed. Yisro shamar leMoshe lech l'shalom halach v'yitzliach. And Yisro, who told Moshe that he should go 2-piece, he was matzliach. Rabbi Levi, Someone who goes from a place of davening to a place of learning, or from a place of learning to a place of davening, that person will merit to greet the Shechina. One will go from one strength to another, and they will be able to see God in Zion, in Yerushalayim. A Talmid Chacham never really has rest. All of us are sitting up late at night learning. We're going to go, hopefully both personally, professionally, in our learning with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and then El Elokim B'Tzion. Just another way to understand this pasuk. The first one, understand it as you are going to be Zochem Makabel Pnei Shechina for those who are Shaku in the Beis HaMedrash and the Beis HaKnesses. And the other is just a general understanding of Talmidei Chachamim. They're constantly chasing another page and they're constantly looking to Chaparain. Like Rabbi Robinson has said many times, Kovei Itim L'Torah, the word Keva also means to grab or to grasp, to steal, to find an extra few minutes. And that is the bracha of the Gemara. It's challenging, but that's the bracha of the Gemara, is that Talmidei Chachamim ein lahem menucha afilu le'olam haba. Hadron alach ve'ilu megalchen uslika Maseches Moed Kattan. We're going to stop right here for tonight. Tomorrow, in Yirtzeh Hashem, I'll be in Cincinnati, and I will pre-record the first blot of Chagiga, Shabbos one blot, Sunday one blot, and Asiyum in Yirtzeh Hashem on Monday night. L'zecher Nishmas, David's father. Yiratzon, you guys should all have a beautiful night, and we'll pick up tomorrow. Kol Tuv.